"Excuse me, miss," his voice rang out light but far from friendly. His eyes flicked quickly down to Clara's leather bag. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong cabin. This seat is elite class." Clara stopped. She didn't appear flustered, nor did she react immediately. She simply held out her phone screen where the ticket information was clearly displayed. LX241, Elite, Seat 3A, Clara Mendez. Lucas glanced at it. His eyes moved quickly from the name to the seat number, then paused on her face. There was a moment, very brief, as if his brain was struggling to process what he had just seen. A thin silence followed, as sharp as the sound of a breath cut short. "Ah," he nodded, lips curling into a smile. Frankfurt International Airport, 6 a.m. The sky was still dim. The tall glass panels were veiled in a faint mist, reflecting the soft golden glow of the lights on the cold marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of dark-roasted Arabica coffee blended with expensive perfumes worn by travelers and that particular smell of impending departure, a scent without a name but one that every seasoned traveler recognizes. The stream of people quietly flowed past the security checkpoint. The clatter of suitcase wheels echoed steadily like a soundtrack composed by no one. Announcements rang through the vast terminal in 4 languages, cold, precise, emotionless. Among the hurried travelers, a middle-aged woman walked at an unhurried pace, Clara Mendez. Clara wasn't the kind of person who turned heads with her looks. But if your eyes happened to rest on her, it would be difficult to look away. Her salt and pepper curls were neatly tied at the nape of her neck, and a burgundy scarf hugged her neck like a gentle embrace. A navy wool coat draped to her knees, neat and classic. Hanging by her side was a worn, dark brown leather bag, the kind of bag used long enough to tell its own story. Clara was not in a rush. Her steps were steady and composed, as if she had nothing to prove to anyone. In her hand, her e-ticket glowed under the terminal's cold lights. Flight LX241 to Lisbon, Elite Class, Seat 3A. In the elite cabin, passengers had mostly settled in. Everything radiated refined luxury, Italian leather seats soft as velvet, reclining cushions, and private curtains neatly drawn between seats. On the small table in front, fresh orange juice and white wine shimmered under warm lighting like liquid honey. Clara entered the cabin. Her deep brown eyes scanned the room, not judging, not comparing, just the habit of someone who had traveled far and long enough to recognize unspoken glances. She moved toward the front row, left side, Seat 3A. Just as she approached, a figure in white stepped quickly into her path. Lucas Brandt, the chief flight attendant, early 30s, tall, neatly styled blonde hair, gray tie tightened to precision. On his wrist, a silver watch gleamed with every turn, clearly chosen as much for display as for timekeeping. Lucas offered a smile, not a welcoming one, but the smile of someone about to correct a mistake. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but far from friendly. His eyes flicked down to Clara's old leather bag. "I'm afraid you might be in the wrong cabin. This seat is for elite class." Clara stopped. She didn't look confused. She didn't react. She simply held out her phone, displaying the ticket information clearly. LX241, Elite, Seat 3A, Clara Mendez. Lucas glanced at it. His eyes quickly moved from the name to the seat, then paused on her face. A moment, fleeting but clear, passed as if his brain was struggling to process what it had just seen. A thin silence, like a breath caught midair. "Ah," he nodded, lips curving into a smile devoid of warmth. "My apologies. Please take your seat." No further greeting. No offer of a drink. No hot towel. Lucas turned and walked away as if he had just resolved a minor technical glitch. Clara said nothing. She didn't look after him. She set her bag beneath the seat, removed her scarf, adjusted her coat, and sat down. Each movement was gentle and deliberate, as if she had faced this exact moment too many times to let it provoke her now. Across the aisle, an elderly couple, Mr. Pascal and Mrs. Helene, were sipping tea and reading a travel magazine together. They quietly observed Clara. Not with judgment or pity, but with the attentiveness of those who had lived long enough to know something speak volumes without being said. Outside the window, the plane began to taxi. The faint morning light cast a soft glow across Clara's face. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, not to sleep, but to gather a moment of peace. She knew this was only the beginning. Clara sat silently by the window, her eyes drifting over the distant, lazily floating clouds. Her hands rested gently in her lap, fingers interlaced. Inside her was a formidable stillness, not because she was weak, but because she was far too familiar with how people looked and judged before ever asking a question. Lucas, the flight attendant, continued moving about the cabin, cheerfully attending to the other passengers. Champagne glasses were refilled, soft blankets adjusted, headphones delivered by hand. Clara still hadn't received any water. It was fine. She was used to it. A while later, a male passenger entered. Tall, dressed in a deep navy suit, with salt and pepper hair and a poised but unhurried gait. His face radiated experience and authority, the kind of presence that made people instinctively look up when he entered a room. He made his way to seat 3C, 1 seat away from Clara. "Excuse me, is 3B taken?" he asked politely. "No, please," Clara replied, her voice low and warm. Lucas promptly appeared from behind, this time with a much brighter smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Dubois. An honor to have you with us again." So it was Jean Dubois, a prominent figure in European finance, often seen at high-level summits. Jean sat down, his eyes briefly glancing at Clara. He smiled softly. "Headed to Lisbon as well?" Clara nodded. "Yes, for work." Jean raised his eyebrows slightly. "What a coincidence." Lucas now returned with a glass of champagne for Jean, without so much as glancing at Clara. Jean raised an eyebrow, glancing sideways. "I was under the impression that elite class passengers are served drinks before takeoff?" Lucas hesitated. Yes, I'll take care of it right away." "No need," Clara interjected, still gazing out the window. "I'm not thirsty." The air tightened ever so slightly. Jean didn't say anything more, but his gaze shifted into one of quiet scrutiny. The plane began to taxi. Clara closed her eyes for a few moments. None of this was unfamiliar, but this time something felt different. Not because Lucas had been rude, but because too many people had witnessed it. And in a premium cabin like this, silence often weighed heavier than words. Not long after, the seatbelt light dinged. The plane had reached cruising altitude. Lucas began distributing breakfast menus. When he reached Clara and Jean's row, he handed Jean his menu first, then turned away to leave. "Did you forget something?" Jean asked, voice calm but firm. Lucas paused, turned back, his expression composed with effort. "I assumed the lady wasn't dining." Jean replied without looking at Clara. "No one asked her." Lucas slowly handed Clara the menu. She accepted it, her eyes fixed on Jean. "Thank you," Clara said. "Not everyone remembers to ask." Jean nodded, his smile as light as air. "But everyone should learn when to stay silent." Frankfurt International Airport, 6 a.m. The air in the first-class cabin seemed to freeze. Every small sound, the clink of a spoon against porcelain, the flip of a glossy magazine, fell silent as the captain himself stepped out of the cockpit. He said nothing at first. He walked straight to the woman of color sitting in seat 3A. Under the cabin lights, tension flickered across his face. "Miss Clara Williams," he began, voice low and formal. "I sincerely apologize for the unacceptable incident earlier. After rechecking the system, we have confirmed that your ticket is registered as a special non-identified elite, a tier reserved exclusively for executive-level strategic partners of our airline." A ripple of hushed whispers rose through the cabin. Passengers glanced at each other, then turned to look at the woman they'd been murmuring about not long before. The woman they'd assumed didn't belong. A trespasser, a stranger, someone who didn't fit. But now, she was revealed to be someone whose access far exceeded all the shiny suits and luxury handbags aboard the flight. Clara remained still. Her expression did not waver. She simply nodded, her voice calm but clear. "I said from the beginning, I wasn't in the wrong seat." Behind the captain stood Olivia, the flight's supervisor. She bowed slightly, her face composed but her eyes betraying discomfort. "Ms. Williams," she said, "we deeply regret the experience you've had. This incident will be reported directly to airline headquarters upon landing. If there's anything you require, please let us know." Clara looked toward the aisle, where Lucas, the flight attendant who had so curtly questioned her, now stood frozen. He didn't dare meet her eyes, and no one else was smirking or whispering anymore. "I don't require anything," Clara replied, pausing briefly. "At least, not yet." Olivia nodded lightly and gestured for Lucas to step away. He walked off unsteadily, as if he had just been removed from a space he'd always assumed was rightfully his. In the cabin, the mood had shifted. The middle-aged man in seat 3C, who had sighed when Clara first arrived, now lowered his gaze in quiet shame. The elderly lady in front slowly turned back, her eyes soft with remorse. I'm truly sorry for having judged you," she murmured, almost whispering. Clara said nothing in return, but she tilted her head, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. Only now did everyone realize. No one had actually looked at Clara's ticket. No one had asked her name. They had only seen her skin color, her understated clothing, and her silence. And they had judged. That judgment, not Clara, had put them in the wrong. Clara opened her phone. A new message had come in. Urgent meeting. Strategy Council, 1600 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Beneath it, her assistant had added, "Following the incident on your flight, the board wants to hear your proposal on revamping crew evaluation protocols. Final decision authority lies with you." Clara smiled. She said nothing and didn't need to. No one was questioning whether she deserved to sit there anymore. A young woman in a hoodie, sitting a few rows back, whispered to her friend, "This is the first time I've seen someone win with silence. And win completely." Her friend nodded. Sometimes real power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's who doesn't need to speak at all, and still silences the entire room. The captain bowed once more and returned to the cockpit. The plane continued its course through the sky, as if no storm had ever occurred. Clara leaned back in her seat. Her ticket bore no name, but her power needed no label. It lay in the dignity she upheld in the face of prejudice, and in the way she made the entire system look inward. And that, truly, was the most powerful seat on the plane. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin now resembled a silent exhibition hall, all eyes fixed on Clara Williams. The woman of color who had once been regarded as not belonging here was now being publicly apologized to by the captain himself. Lucas had vanished, likely taken to the crew quarters to write a statement, or perhaps gathering his final thoughts before an unavoidable disciplinary hearing. Clara set her coffee cup down on the table, then rose to her feet, for the first time since boarding the plane. She stepped gracefully into the center of the cabin, where everyone could see her face and presence clearly. Not angry, not loud, but with a silent gravity that followed every step she took. Olivia, the head flight attendant, stood beside her, a quiet acknowledgement that Clara was no longer just a regular passenger. "I know many of you are wondering," Clara began, her voice low, steady, and full of quiet power. "I'm not surprised to have been misjudged. I'm used to it. But today, I decided not to remain silent." No one said a word. Not even the clink of a spoon against a glass could be heard. "I didn't buy this ticket on a website," she continued. "And because of that, my name wasn't on the standard passenger manifest." She paused, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek, black metal card. She placed it gently on the center table, where Olivia immediately bent down, picked it up and held it up for all to see. Black Founder Access, Infinity Airlines. An exclusive card not available for purchase, granted only to founders, investors, and the highest-level executives of the airline. "I'm Clara Williams," she continued, her tone calm, "Executive Chairwoman and largest shareholder of Infinity Airlines, the very airline you're flying with." A sharp inhale was heard from the back of the cabin. Some passengers craned their necks to see better. Others lowered their eyes, in embarrassment or perhaps shame. "And my ticket," she said, "doesn't need to bear a name, because I personally approved every policy of this airline." Olivia nodded in affirmation, then turned to the captain. He immediately picked up the internal phone and began issuing urgent instructions to ground control. "I'm not saying this to assert power," Clara concluded. "I'm saying it to remind you that kindness and respect should never depend on a title, skin color, or the clothes you wear." She returned to seat 3A. The same gaze, calm but sharp as a blade tempered by years of endurance. On Lauren's forehead, the flight attendant who had previously shown her disdain, Beads of cold sweat had formed. She now stood just behind the curtain of the service area, a shadow stripped of its mask. In the still quiet cabin, Mr. Jean Dubois finally spoke. Slowly but with conviction. "Mrs. Clara, may I, on behalf of those of us who remained silent here, offer you my apology." Clara looked at him, her eyes briefly glinting with emotion. "Silence," she said, "is sometimes complicity, but recognizing it and choosing to correct it is the first step toward change." Jean nodded, his glasses catching the light. The air in the business class cabin was thick, heavy with silence. The flight had just landed at Bern Airport, Switzerland. No one stood up. Every eye was fixed on the woman of color who calmly rose from seat 3A, the same seat a flight attendant had insisted she wasn't worthy of sitting in just hours before. Clara Williams, dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit, stepped into the aisle. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to act outraged, didn't need to scream for justice. Her silence in that moment was the loudest declaration of all. Two of Clara's assistants entered from the private door. One held documents with the Infinity Airlines logo, the other was already coordinating via Bluetooth headset. The captain, having just received a direct call from the board, bowed his head to her. Clara didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes were fixed on Lauren, the flight attendant who had slapped her not long before. Eyes calm, but sharp like a finely honed blade. "Do you know what you've just done?" Clara asked, her voice quiet yet crystal clear, carrying through the cabin like the first notes of a coming storm. Lauren froze, eyes wide. The color drained from her face. There was no forced smile left on her lips. She couldn't fathom, couldn't believe, that the quiet, reserved woman throughout the flight was Clara Williams, the CEO behind Infinity Airlines, the very luxury airline she worked for. Clara took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over every row. The passengers who had stayed silent began to nod subtly, some even covering their mouths in shame. "I was disrespected, insulted, and assaulted on a plane that belongs to me." Clara's voice was unwavering. She didn't need to raise it for everyone to hear. An older passenger stood from the back and nodded. "I saw everything. She did nothing wrong." A young woman whispered, "That happened to me too. I just didn't have the power to speak out." Clara stopped in the center of the cabin and turned to the captain. "I demand the immediate suspension of flight attendant Lauren Meyer, and I expect a full internal report within 24 hours. No cover-ups. No excuses." The captain nodded. One of Clara's assistants pulled out a phone, recording voice notes. The other opened an iPad, already logged into the company's system. Clara turned to Grace, the junior flight attendant who had remained silent throughout the journey. "Grace." Her tone softened. Grace startled. "Why, yes, Ms. Williams." Clara looked directly at her, not harshly. "You hesitated, but I saw kindness in your eyes. I want you in the management training program. Your application will be sent to your email this week." Grace could barely believe it. "Thank you, ma'am. Truly thank you." 2 days later, at Infinity Airlines headquarters, Clara held a press conference. In minimalist attire, she stood under the lights with steely eyes. Discrimination doesn't start with grand gestures. It begins with a look, an assumption, and it will never end if no one dares to stand up. She announced 3 changes: the immediate suspension and investigation of Lauren Meyer, the launch of a new training program called Respect Above All, and the creation of a direct hotline for passengers to report discrimination. The press covered it extensively. Hashtags like #RespectIsNotOptional, #CEO and #Clara Williams trended across social media. Passenger footage of the incident was shared millions of times. A CEO slapped on her own airline, and she turned that slap into an industry-wide reckoning. 1 week later, Clara boarded another plane, this time bound for Oslo. As soon as she entered the cabin, the crew bowed slightly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams. It's an honor to serve you today." Clara smiled softly. "I'm just a passenger, like everyone else." She took her seat in 1A and looked out the window. The clouds drifted below the wing, white as unwritten paper. That day, she didn't check emails or take any virtual meetings. She simply gazed outside and reflected on the message she had sent to the world. No one is invisible. No one should endure insult because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. Later that evening, in a televised interview, a reporter asked, "If you could say one thing to those who've ever been belittled, insulted, or made to feel like outsiders, what would it be?" Clara smiled, her eyes steady with resolve. "You don't need fame to demand respect. You just need to know who you are, and never accept silence as the answer." And just like that, the flight that had begun in conflict didn't end with a landing, it became a takeoff. For a new system, a new culture, one where respect is no longer a privilege but a principle. 3 months later, a sunny June day at the Infinity Academy, the airline's training institute located on the outskirts of Zurich. In the main hall, where portraits of the founding members and early CEOs are displayed, a new frame had just been hung. Ebony wood, silver trim. Inside, a black and white photograph of Clara Williams, her eyes looking directly into the lens. No elaborate makeup, no authoritative pose, just a quiet composure. Yet within it, a declaration. Beneath the image, the inscription read, "Respect doesn't start with rank. It starts with humanity." Clara Williams, chairwoman of Infinity Airlines. A group of about 20 new trainees sat neatly in the auditorium. On stage, the trainer, now Grace, promoted to head of service culture, was retelling the story of that day. No embellishments, no dramatization, just the truth. "I once stood less than a meter away from her," Grace said, "and I stayed silent, out of fear, out of hierarchy, out of deference. But today I stand here because I learned, when you don't speak up for what's right, you've already chosen the other side." Applause broke out, not for drama, but for truth. Meanwhile, at Infinity's executive office in Geneva, Clara was reviewing the final expansion plan for the implicit bias recognition and resolution program, a project launched in the wake of the LX-241 incident. Since then, over 70% of frontline staff had undergone retraining, not just in procedures but in social awareness, diversity, and empathy. An assistant entered, placing a report on her desk. "Madam Chairwoman, we've just received a letter of appreciation from the European Passenger Rights Association. Also, Astrojet just announced they're launching a similar training program." Clara nodded without a word. She turned to look at the sign mounted on the wall. #Respect is not optional. Months later, another story. A domestic flight from Barcelona to Berlin. A young flight attendant, Elias, spotted an elderly African man stepping into the business class cabin. A few passengers' eyes subtly shifted. Elias stepped forward, nodded, and smiled. "Welcome aboard, sir. Thank you for choosing Infinity Airlines. Your seat, 1F, is ready, and I'd be honored to serve you today." The man froze, as if caught off guard by a gentle shock. "You mean that? Not just polite theater?" Elias smiled. "I mean it, sir. Here, respect doesn't need to be earned." The man bowed slightly. "Miss Clara Williams. She changed an entire generation, didn't she?" Elias nodded. "And I'm proud to be part of that generation." Years later, when Clara had stepped down from her executive role, she lived quietly in the Portuguese countryside, where the sun was golden, the olive grove serene, and the sea as gentle as her nature. One day, a young journalist arrived, hoping to interview her about the incident back then. Clara smiled and looked out over the wheat fields beyond her porch. "I don't want to be remembered for what I once did. I just hope people remember that once, when someone was treated as invisible, she made the whole world see her, and no one could look away again."